So before Olmsted, origins of Louisville's park system. A lot of my information comes from Sam Thomas. Sam Thomas was a noted Louisville historian, wrote this book called The Origins of Louisville Olmsted Parks and Parkways. When this book was, when Sam passed away in around, I think it was 2010 is when he passed away, or 2012, this book was not published. And his widow, Debbie Thomas, did not have any money to publish the book. And she mentioned that to me, and I was able to talk to another wealthy Louisvillian and ask him if he could possibly publish it, which he then did. And I got to write the book review for this in the Courier-Journal after it was published in 2013. So The Origins of Louisville's Olmsted Parks and Parkways by Sam Thomas. Excellent book, and I think there's a copy of it up here on the front table. So as noted, many people think that Frederick Law Olmsted came to Louisville and just waved his magic wand and the parks just appeared. Well, here's what happened before and after he came to Louisville. First, hopefully everyone loves our parks. We have some beautiful parks, not only the Olmsted Parks, but the Waterfront Park, as well as the new Parklands of Floyd's Fork. We've got some great parks here locally. So back when the city was formed, back in 1780, we had a population of around 200. Then by early 1830s, population had swelled to 11,000. And then by mid-1870s, we were up to 112,000 population. So within 100 years, we had grown by about 112,000 people. So we were a rapidly growing city in the 1800s. We also had some very major manufacturing industry that developed in the late 1800s. Here's a view of where a lot of that industry is, where the L&N Railroad went through Louisville. So you had Western Louisville and then Old Louisville, where the residents lived, and then they would work at the factories adjacent to the L&N Railroad. So that's where our industrial basis was. Here are some of the major manufacturing businesses in Louisville in the mid to late 1800s. So here's a map of Louisville in 1884. Population was now up to 140,000 population, rapidly growing city. And if you look right there, that dark rectangle, that was known as the Southern Exposition of 1883 to 1886. It was a major showcase of Louisville manufacturing and products and various things that we produced here in the city. And we were doing this to showcase it for the southern states to rebuild after the Civil War. And so we had this phenomenal sort of a World's Fair, if you will, of exposition in Louisville, this massive structure that they built. So here's a site plan of the Southern Exposition, and in the center there is that massive building. But if you notice on either side, the left and the right sides, it's landscaped area. It's horticultural, botanical gardens. And so 2/3 of the Southern Exposition was actually landscape sort of design. Even though we had this massive building to feature the manufacturing goods, we were also educating the public on horticultural and botany related things about Louisville. So here were the parks prior to 1887. And they were all, if you notice very closely, very small in area. 1/4 of an acre, 4 acres, not very large whatsoever. And several of these were once cemeteries. For instance, Baxter Square, which was developed in 1880, was a former cemetery that they transferred into a public park. In the upper right-hand corner is a historic photograph of the park. By the way, do you think they got everyone out when they reinterred everyone? Not quite. No, there's still some ghost stories there around Baxter Square.
Yeah, that's why they said that's why the area is like it because they're probably like it.
Yeah. So Baxter Square, it was once known as the Pioneer Cemetery. And Cave Hill Cemetery was publicized or promoted as a park as well, that you can go to Cave Hill and sort of enjoy the landscape, the scenic beauty of it. By the way, the black and white photograph on the left was in the late 1890s, and the photograph on the right is of the same area, but just a more recent photograph, so you can see how it's developed over the past 100 years, Cave Hill. But it was known for its scenic beauty and encouragement to get out to nature, if you will. And it still is today. So here's the population growth of Louisville from 1790 up to 1890. And you can see how the city grew from 15th in the nation to 14th to 12th. And then the leadership noticed that it was starting to increase in numbers. So we went from 14th to 16th to 20th. We were losing our major status as a city. We weren't attracting as many people as we once were in the early formation. So that started to be of concern to the civic leadership here. There was a lot of competition from other Midwest cities, Cincinnati, Cleveland, St. Louis, Chicago. The map there that you see on the right, that's of Chicago. So these other Midwest cities were starting to overcome Louisville, become greater than our city. And that, again, the civic leadership was concerned about that. But we did have some major projects being implemented at that time in the late 1880s. These buildings were under construction along with many others. But we were still a major sized city, but the civic leadership was concerned that we were starting to lose our major status.
What's in the place of the Columbia building?
That is at northwest corner of 4th and West Main, and there's an office building there. In fact, they could have easily have renovated the Columbia. It was this, they sort of replaced it with another building of a similar nature and could have easily have renovated it. And so the Salmagundi Club, they were a local organization of civic leadership, and one of their members, Thomas Speed, suggested that we might want to consider implementing a public park system in Louisville. And here's a little information about Speed. He was a cousin to Joshua and James Speed of the Farmington Speeds and Friends of Lincoln. He was in the Union Army. He was on William Tecumseh's Sherman's staff, March to the Sea, and some other things. And he was a member of the Salmagundi Club. So he was the one that first said, hey, we may want to consider a parks system.
Do you have any idea where that name Salmagundi came from?
Here you go, right here. So here's Salmagundi. It was founded in 1879 as a gentleman's literary club. Locally, there were 24 members, and they were all very prominent people. The name Salmagundi actually means a dish, a pungent mixture, or a stew in which conversation of cultural, societal topics occurred. So that's the definition of it. It was mainly just a conversation club as such. And you would...
Be over there and pick it up on
St. James Court?
And then there are other similar organizations. The New York chapter has over 600 members. And I'll talk about the Salmagundians later in the program. One of them, again, was Andrew Cowan. And Cowan, hearing Tom Speed say, hey, let's do a park system, Cowan picks up the initiative and says, hey, I'll do a paper on that. I'll write an editorial about how such a park could be implemented. Now, Cowan was from Scotland. He moved to New York. He was in the Union Army. And after the Civil War, he moved to Louisville and formed the Cowan Company, which was a leather goods merchant down on Main Street. And he was a member of the Salmagundi Club. But more famously, Cowan was in the Civil War, and during Pickett's charge there in July of 1864 at Gettysburg, he was right there in the very center. If you see where that little, on the right there, a little green dot, it says Corps of Trees. That's where Cowan's men were stationed with their cannon batteries. And so as Pickett came up, Pickett's charge came up the ridge there, Cemetery Ridge, Cowan told his men to wait and shoot when they saw the whites of their eyes. They got within about 20 yards of Cowan's battery, the Confederates did, before Cowan commanded his men to open fire. And as it says there in the text on the left, the entire Confederate line disappeared when they fired their guns. So he was a hero at Gettysburg and helped defeat Pickett's charge that day. He was known as the high watermark of the Confederacy. After this battle, Confederacy was pretty much in decline and defeat. And there is a monument there in the lower center portion. That's a monument at Gettysburg dedicated to Andrew Cowan and his cannon battery. So he was a hero at Gettysburg. So Cowan wrote an editorial on June 5th, 1887 in the Courier-Journal newspaper. This was the front page of that paper. But here's his editorial there on the right. And you can see it's on page 12. And it talks about the public parks. And Cowan really goes into a lot of detail about how these parks can happen. He set out 4 goals for the parks. To advance the city. They no longer wanted to be second rate. They felt like they were being second rate, no longer a first rate city. They wanted to retain their labor force for their manufacturing businesses. They wanted to attract population and increase the tax revenues. And I'll explain how all that happens. He was aided by Charles Hermany. Charles Hermany headed up the Louisville Water Company back in 1887. And Hermany developed this plan that you see where the 3 parks could be located. An eastern park, a western park, and a southern park. And this was part of Cowan's editorial. You can see it there in the upper right-hand corner of Cowan's text. But as we all know, where the eastern park was proposed, where Hermany wanted it, because he had the water company, flooding is a major issue there, and it still is. This photograph was taken a year or 2 ago down at River Road and Zorn Avenue. And so they couldn't place the eastern park as per what Hermany wanted to do due to the flooding. This is Cowan's description on the left, talking about the western park, about what it should be, how it should be developed. And within the text, Cowan talked about who should manage the parks, how should they be administered. And if you look at the 3rd paragraph there, the last sentence of that 3rd paragraph, it says, no question of party politics should enter into the appointment of these commissioners. So he's basically saying party politics should not be influenced in the parks situation. Do you think that happened? Yeah, well, we'll discuss that. But they were actually, we talk about that a lot today, but they were discussing it, 135 or so, 36 years ago. So the first parks commissioners elected on July 1st of 1890 were these individuals. Castleman was one, Finzer, Cowan, Layer, Bond, and Shirley. There was some of their photographs on the right. Then Finzer, for whatever reason, he dropped out. He may have passed away, but he was replaced with Reuben T. Durrett. And Durrett was a famous historian here. He helped found the Filson Historical Society, very much active in the civic affairs of Louisville, Reuben Durrett was. So he replaced Finzer. Also at this same time, in the early 1890s, planning was underway for the Chicago World's Fair, and here are some images of that. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the Chicago World's Fair, very famous fair. 1893 is when it opened. But a number of Louisvillians were involved in the planning of the fair. In the upper right-hand corner, that is Bertha Palmer. She was on the planning committee for the fair, and she was the wife of Potter Palmer. Palmer House, you may have heard of the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago, very influential. Potter Palmer was a very wealthy individual, and Bertha was his wife, and she was a native Louisvillian. She was born here in Louisville, so she knew about Louisville and had a lot of connections here to the city. In the lower right-hand corner, that is Enid Yandel. She was a artist, sculptor, and she did a number of the sculptures there at the Chicago World's Fair. And she was hired by Bertha Palmer because on the lower left-hand corner, you see John Castleman there. Castleman was a good friend of Bertha Palmer and recommended that Enid Yandel be retained to do those sculptures for the Chicago World's Fair. So we had a number of Louisvillians involved in the planning of the Chicago World's Fair. And lo and behold, who else was at Chicago planning the World's Fair? Was none other than Frederick Law Olmsted. And so Olmsted was up in Chicago, us down in Louisville. With all these people involved, we were able to convince Olmsted to come to Louisville to give a talk on parks on May 20th of 1891. So we brought Olmsted to Louisville. He made a talk here at the old Pendennis Club, which was on Walnut Street. It's now called Muhammad Ali Boulevard. But where it once was located is where the old Stewart's department store is. It's now a hotel, Embassy Suites, I think, hotel. Well, anyways, Olmsted came and gave a civic talk to the leadership here on May 20th, 1891 about the benefits of a parks system. And also attending was Mayor Charles Jacob. Jacob was very influential mayor. He was elected 4 different times. He was independently wealthy. And he was there, and while Olmsted was here in town, he was able to retain Olmsted to design the parks. Several trivia on Mayor Jacob. Number one, since he was elected several times between 1872 and 1884, the Metro Council changed the law that prevented him to be reelected. That we then went to a one-term mayor and not multiple-term mayor process, and that only changed with with merger in the early 2000s. We used to just have single-term mayors, but since Jacob was multi-term, he was able to get a lot of things done because he was in office a long time, was able to plan and implement things. And one of them was the Parks Initiative. He used his own money to buy a section in South Louisville called Burnt Knob. Burnt Knob was actually outside the city limits, but everyone had talked about it to become a park. But yet, how do you do that? Again, it was outside the city limits. So Jacob uses his own money, buys Burnt Knob for a future park. In fact, the Metro Council almost impeached him over that, saying you just can't buy land for the city outside city limits. It was a major scandal and controversy back in the day. But again, Jacob was very powerful, very wealthy, long-term process there. And he said, to heck with you guys, I know what's best for the city, we're going to get it done. So he was very progressive in that manner.
Was that called Jacob's Folly?
Yeah, it was called Jacob's Folly. And what was your question? Yeah, Iroquois Park, that's correct. It was also called Burnt Knob, Jacob's Folly, or Jacob's Park, and Iroquois Park. This is his house on 4th Street. It's still standing just down the street here from where we're standing right now. It's still there. Yeah, it's the old Jacob house. So they brought Frederick Law Olmsted here, and they hired him to do the parks, and here's some of his bio as noted. If you're ever interested in a good book on biography, I highly recommend a book on Frederick Law Olmsted. You name it, he was all over the country traveling the world. Very fascinating, colorful character. I kind of equate him to the Forrest Gump of his day. He was always at the right place at the right time, it seemed, to do things.
Mental health? Did he kind of do mental health?
Yeah, I will discuss that later in the program. He was familiar with Louisville. Even though he did not come here for this project, he helped plan the Quartermaster Depot, which is over in Jeffersonville. And the Quartermaster Depot was a military supply warehouse, if you will, where they kept a lot of the military-related gear, and he helped plan that. So he somewhat knew where Louisville was, if you will, because of that. Now then, as noted, Olmsted always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. I want to give due to this person here, Andrew Jackson Downing. As noted, he was a landscape architect from Newburgh, New York. He was a friend and mentor to Frederick Law Olmsted, And it was actually Andrew Jackson Downing who had the vision for Central Park in New York City. It was his baby. He was going to implement it and have it done. But unfortunately, as noted there, he was traveling on the Hudson River. Newburgh, New York is upstream of New York City by about 2 hours. So to travel back and forth between Newburgh and New York, he would use the Hudson River. And one day on a boat, it caught fire, and Downing unfortunately drowned at the age of 36. But his partner, Frederick Law Olmsted, took over from there. By the way, I also wanted to mention that Andrew Jackson Downing is also remembered for house designs that he did. He did a picture book or an illustration book of just sketches of country houses. And these houses, this book was sent throughout the country, and a number of rural residents, farmers and all, who wanted a nice house, bought the book and then would have these houses constructed around the country. And we have several of them here in Louisville. The Brown House there on Hubbard's Lane, it's now called Woodhaven Bed and Breakfast, and of course the Hurstburn Country Club were remnants of Andrew Jackson Downing's homes that he designed. As noted, Downing drowned. I actually visited his gravesite a few years ago up in Newburgh, New York. Oh, it says Cave Hill, Cedar Hill. Yeah, Cedar Hill. I almost said Cave Hill. Cedar Hill Cemetery in Newburgh. And it was age 36, but if you notice his burial site there says age 37, but he was only 36 when he drowned. And again, he was involved in Central Park, and 2/3 of the park were designed as Andrew Jackson Downing wanted it designed. Even though Frederick Law Olmsted gets all the credit for Central Park, Downing had a lot of influence on it. That's why I give a little asterisk there at the bottom.
As a guest, Steve, how much acreage do you think is in that?
Oh my gosh.
Hundreds.
Oh yeah, hundreds of thousands of acres. It's massive. Has everyone been to Central Park in New York?
But I couldn't tell how big it was.
Yeah, it's huge, yes. You can see how many blocks it is. You can't walk it. It's just way too big. You take the subway. In fact, you catch the subway at one end, and they have various subway stops along the way, yeah. I think it goes from like 52nd Street up to 110th Street, if I have that right. 50 blocks, maybe?
Yeah.
Something like that. And so Olmsted helped create 3 major parks. Of course, Cherokee on the east, Shawnee on the west, and Iroquois on the south. Along with his sons, John and Frederick Jr. They were all involved in the park design. Parkways were also created and built that linked the parks together. This is my little diagram of the parkways. We have Southwest, Algonquin, Northwestern, Eastern, and Southern Parkway. And they all kind of merged right there in the center, but unfortunately, for whatever reason, we never did quite link them up. You know, they're kind of not quite all, there's no major point where they meet, but they're all very close to each other where they terminate there. And if you notice where that oval is, that is where Churchill Downs is. That's the original clubhouse of Churchill Downs at that location. And that clubhouse was the Louisville Jockey Club. Of course, Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. Founded the Louisville Jockey Club, which is now the Kentucky Derby, which in a few weeks we will celebrate again.
I know you'll get into this, Steve, but how come the parks have Indian names?
Well, I won't, but we'll discuss that at the end, yes. And then Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., he was into horse racing. When he honeymooned, they went over to Europe. He got really interested in horse racing and then came back to Louisville to form the Louisville Jockey Club. And just a little genealogy of his name, which is kind of unique. It all starts with Thomas Jefferson, who brings George Rogers Clark here to Louisville. George Rogers Clark's brother was William Clark, whose partner was Meriwether Lewis on the Northwest expedition. And then when William Clark had a son, he named him for his expedition partner, Meriwether Lewis. And when Meriwether Lewis married Abigail Prather Churchill, there's the Churchill name coming into play. When they had a son, they named him Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., and he built the Louisville Jockey Club, aka Churchill Downs, on the Churchill property there in South Louisville. So hopefully you all can remember that when the Kentucky Derby comes around, but that's how it all came about. And one other aspect to the parkway was John Castleman. He was influential in the location of Eastern Parkway. Again, we talked about politics early on. Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. wanted Southern Parkway and the connection to Iroquois Park to run by Churchill Downs, and John Castleman wanted to run Eastern Parkway by his property there at Eastern Parkway and Baxter Avenue, and which he did. And he donated that land, that center strip area, for the parkway. And I'll talk about Castleman and the controversy here a little bit later on as well. Some additional parks that were designed by the Olmsted firm. Central Park. By the way, Central Park was existing prior to Olmsted, but Olmsted came through and gave a new plan for that. And then he did Shelby Park, Boone Square. I think the Olmsted firm did 9 parks here total in Louisville. And the parks were funded by a thing called the TIF, the tax increment financing. It was very revolutionary back in those days, back in the late 1800s, which basically what they said was if you did a major public civic funded project, it would improve the financial property around it. Basically, you raise the property taxes of those adjacent to the public facility, whatever you're building. And that's what they said about the parks. If we were going to build these parks, that it's going to raise the property values around the parks, because a lot of people want to live around the parks, right? So it's going to raise the property values up, increase tax money to the government that in turn are going to pay for the parks. We're now doing a lot of these TIFs now in Louisville. I think they just voted on a new one just the other day. But the next major TIF, does anyone know what a major TIF is now in Louisville? Yum Arena. That was a major TIF that was created in the early 2000s to pay for the Yum Arena. So it was very...
Something about a tax increment TIF for the West End, too.
Yeah, TIF in the West End.
For that Shawnee apartment building that they put in, for affordable housing. They were
Right.
talking about,
Everyone wants to do a TIF now. But back then, the parks were the first Louisville TIF. So, how did the parks succeed? How did we were able to do all this? We had passionate advocates with Andrew Cowan and John Castleman. Castleman was the project manager. Cowan was the visionary. He's the one that set out the overall goals for the parks, whereas Castleman was the day-to-day manager to make sure that the parks got built. He literally would ride his horse from one end to the other end of Louisville on a daily basis to check the progress of the construction. Of course, the Southern Exposition changed attitudes for the value of parks and raised the bar and set forth goals and expectations for Louisville. Charles Jacob, with his continuity, was able to get it done, and his wealth as well. And then the Salmagundi Club, they had all the civic leaders buy into it. So it was an overall meshing of the civic leadership that came together to make sure the park succeeded. I'm not sure if we've been able to do that since then, but that was some of the reasons why the park succeeded. So after Olmsted, so did all those, by building these parks, were we successful in those goals? These 4 things that were mentioned, here are the goals for the parks that Andrew Cowan set out. Were we successful on advancing the city, retaining the labor force, attracting population, increasing property values? How successful were we? Well, believe it or not, right after the parks were completed, Ford Motor Company announces they were building a plant at the convergence of all 3 parkways in 1913. So Ford came to Louisville, And the reason why they chose that site was the parkways were sort of the interstates of the day. All parts of Louisville, workers from all over the community could easily get to Ford along those parkways. So that was a very advantageous part. Then when Henry Ford changed the assembly method from vertical to horizontal, he built his horizontal plant out on Southwestern Parkway. So Ford Motor Company initially, and then we still have several major Ford plants here still locally. So that was a major achievement. U of L in the 1920s, located also at the Parkway convergence. They bought the old House of Refuge site, which is in the upper left-hand corner. It was an orphanage, and they converted it to their campus. And some of the old orphanage buildings are there in the upper right-hand corner that are still existing at U of L. So right there at that convergence, we have all of that happening. All very strategic, all a result of the parkways and the parks. A lot of residential was built up around the parks, again, raising the property values. And we're still building massive residential construction around the parks. Andrew Cowan himself built a new house adjacent to Cherokee Park. There's Big Rock in the upper left-hand corner. Hopefully you all Louisvillians know where Big Rock is located. And his former estate is known as the Cherokee neighborhood, and it's a combination of the names of Cherokee and Seneca Parks, and that's how the Cherokee neighborhood was developed around Andrew Cowan's home, which is still there. Now then, as some of you know, Castleman had a little controversy in the past few years. His statue there in Cherokee Triangle was heavily graffitied and very controversial. A online petition was circulated that gathered thousands of signatures. Thousands of people approved this online petition. However, all of the facts on this petition were incorrect. They said he owned slaves, that he was Confederate general, that he, what else?
Yes, he did not own slaves. He was a Confederate general.
No, he was not. And all these facts were incorrect. He was a Confederate major, but he was not a general. So all of the facts on this petition were incorrect, but unfortunately it biased a lot of people against Castleman and created to the removal of his statue.
Where's the statue now?
I'll explain shortly. So, after Castleman's, and by the way, the other thing that this petition said, now I thought about the other thing that this petition said was that he segregated the park system, which he did not. So there are three major things on this petition which were totally incorrect. He was not a Confederate general, he did not segregate the parks, he did not own slaves, and all three of those were on this. And by the way, if all three of those things had been correct, then I would have supported removing the statue. After Castleman's death, he died in 1918, a number of prominent African Americans wrote a letter to the Courier-Journal in 1924, and you see them there listed in the center. All of those were very prominent African American leaders, saying that if General Castleman was still alive in 1924, the parks would not be segregated. That's when they segregated the parks, was in 1924, 6 years after Castleman died. Castleman, during his lifetime, pledged to the African American community he would not segregate the parks, that he valued the African American community, he was very much friends with them, and did a variety of beneficial civic things associated with the African Americans. So that's why all these famous African Americans were outraged when the parks were segregated in 1924, saying Castleman, if he had been alive, would not have permitted this. And then on the right-hand side, there was right when Castleman died in 1918, this one African American wrote this glowing tribute to Castleman about his life and how he treated African Americans. So he was a friend to African Americans. It's so unfortunate what transpired just recently with his statue. I actually put together all of these fact sheets which tried to negate that narrative that had been developed that Castleman was a bigot, that he was a racist and all that. He actually battled racist. By the way, speaking of how the parks were named, many politicians wanted the parks named after politicians, but Castleman said, no, we're not naming them after politicians, we're naming them after Native Americans whose property this originally was. So Castleman was even behind the naming of the parks he was very, for his time period, very progressive, even though he lived in a Jim Crow era. And he was very big in women's suffragette. He funded Susan B. Anthony and her efforts for women's right to vote. He rode in suffragette parades. He benefited Enid Yandel. So he was very progressive. But
His wife was a suffragette.
yeah, his wife was a suffragette. So anyways, we put together a number of things as to why the statue was not it was not a military. It was actually, the statue was for his leadership of the parks and equestrian, not so much for his military duties. It did not have a weapon and all that. So anyways, we put all that together. So where does it stand? Well, just recently, there I am in the lower right-hand corner there. I'm in that photograph. We were at the Kentucky Supreme Court arguing the Castleman case. It will be decided later this year, and we think the Kentucky Supreme Court will agree with us and allow the Castleman statue to be returned. Currently, it is in a storage lot off of Lexington Road with a big tarp over it. So that's where it currently is located. So we're working on that. Besides the Olmsted Parks, many private residential landscapes were designed by Olmsted firm. Perhaps the most famous or infamous was known as the Drummond Estate out on Wolf Pen Branch and Brownsboro Road. Here is a Leo magazine article about it, talking about the Drummond. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Properties to prevent the East End Bridge from being built. Bridge opponents put all of the properties in the East End on the National Register, knowing that you can't use federal funds to build a highway through a National Register property. So they used it as a mechanism to prevent the East End Bridge. And they said that this Drummond was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted's firm, that the landscape was designed by Olmsted. Or was it? You be the judge. So I'll show you. So here, and it's hard to see this, but this is actually an original Olmsted firm drawing of the Drummond estate. It's on file at the Filson Historical Society. It still exists. It's just down the street here in their archives. There's the Drummond house itself. So I kind of cleaned that drawing up, and here you can view it better. This is the Olmsted concept. You can see how it's laid out there based on the 1905 landscape plan. Now this is an aerial view of the existing Drummond estate. You can kind of see where the roadway is there. And this is how the roadway is actually implemented and built. So now you can compare the two. What Olmsted drew up on the left and what actually was built on the right. Do you think they're the same drawing? Do you think they're the same layout? I'll leave it up to you whether or not you think Olmsted actually did this. My opinion is he did not. This was not built as per Olmsted. So for us to have put this on the National Register is what I call a full landscape design Olmsted thing. So we ended up building $260 million tunnel underneath this full Olmsted landscape under the Drummond. I'm not sure if y'all have driven through the tunnels or not. Hopefully you enjoy your $260 million going underneath of this. And there it is there. By the way, we did try to take this off of the National Register. We've argued that it's not an Olmsted plan. It wasn't built like that. But the owner of the property at the time would not allow us to take it off the National Register. You need the owner's permission to remove it. And so who owned the Drummond at that point? The state of Kentucky. And the state of Kentucky said, no, we're still building our highway through this and spending $260 million.
So I think it would have been cheaper not to have the tunnels built?
Oh yes, much cheaper, yes. By the way, who pays that $260 million?
We did.
Yeah.
We haven't crossed it.
You taxpayers do, yes.
Anybody that drives across it.
So there we go. We did try to remove it, but could not do it. A lot of people think the Olmsted firm designed Cave Hill Cemetery. He did not. The original designers were Benjamin Grove and Edmund Lee in the mid-1800s. Olmsted did not want a golf course on his properties. He wanted passive recreation and not active recreation. He felt it wasn't good to have people eating picnic lunches being hit by golf balls on his golf courses.
He was a smart man.
And so he opposed, his firm opposed this, but we still implemented the golf course. By the way, I'm not sure if y'all are golfers or not, but I'm not a big fan of the Cherokee golf course, and it wouldn't bother me one bit if it was removed. But
It would be a great place to have a walk.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
it's beautiful. It should have been where the Botanical Gardens was, if you ask
Do you
me.
want to have sheep grazing in the park?
Yeah, he had sheep grazing, and that would be a passive activity. He did design Bernheim Forest. I was out there this morning, and the firm was involved with Bernheim. Beautiful area. And the Salmagundi Club exists to this day. Gil Holland is a member who's a good friend of mine, and Grady Clay was a member, and they still are. And I don't think we have any Salmagundians here today, but they still do exist and still meet. So Frederick Law Olmsted, he did the concept for the park system. He retired from his firm in 1895 due to mental health. He was having dementia concerns, and he died in 1903. His two sons, John and Frederick Jr., implemented the vision. Unfortunately, many of the bios on Frederick Law Olmsted do not mention the Louisville system as part of his designs, primarily because it wasn't built during his life period, that his sons actually implemented it, so they give it more to the firm and not to himself, Olmsted personally. And so what about the population? So unfortunately, it didn't reverse our population growth any. We still did not grow very much over those next 100 years. But we always are rated very high in quality of life, which I find more of value than being a large city like in Atlanta or Chicago. I'd rather be our size than the problems that those folks have, or even in Nashville nowadays. We also built a nice waterfront park. And we just built the Parklands of Floyd's Fork out there with David Jones and all that. It's beautiful. And we are known as the City of Parks. Just phenomenal parks, and hopefully everyone gets out to enjoy all those. So in general, here's a quick summary of how all this happened. Louisville is a growing city with major manufacturing. Other Midwest cities were starting to overtake us. Southern Exposition came along. Salmagundi Club said, hey, let's build on the Southern Exposition. Let's do something else major after that. Olmsted was brought in to design the parks. Parkways were connected, and we've enjoyed our parks ever since. Again, if you're interested in my books, and thanks for attending. Good deal.